Come with me to a magical place where being labeled the pork queen is a compliment, where being nice is just a way of life, and where all leaders of the free world must pass through. Welcome to Iowa. Whether you're a current Iowan, an Iowa expat, or an Iowan at heart, this show is for you. This is the Iowa Podcast. Real Iowans, real talk, no drama. I'm Justin Brady, and today I'm joined with Sean Finn, a policy analyst at Common Good Iowa. Sean, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Justin.
So I saw the piece in the Des Moines Register. That's originally how this got on my radar, and it's about wage theft in Iowa, which, you know, like I was telling you before we started recording, I remember working hourly, and I remember some bosses being not so kind, and so this resonated with me. But before we talk about wage theft and all those nefarious people stealing your money, have you subscribed yet? It's free, guys. No credit card, no nothing. You don't get charged. And it's free on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, iHeart, Amazon, everywhere. So make sure to subscribe for free. And also, in your app, give this show 5 stars. If you do, the app says, 5 stars, huh? You must like this. I think I will serve it up to other smart people like you. So make sure to do that today, okay? There's just like something baked into me. It drives me insane when people aren't treated with respect and when they're not given, what they've worked for. So let's go over this. How much in loss was, I saw this in the register, so some of this will probably be a repeat for you, but I want to dig into this a little bit deeper. So $900 million loss per year that Iowa workers are basically losing. Did I get that right?
Yeah, that's right. We look at it, about 1 in 7 Iowa workers are affected in some form of wage theft, and that's combines to be over $900 million a year.
1 in 7?
Yeah. Okay,
so the obvious question here is, how confident are you in that number? I think that's where we start, right? How did you get to that number?
Absolutely. Well, I could bore you with all the details of the analysis, but we essentially used federal survey data about Iowa workers' work experiences and their income information. We used that data to find out where, how many people are not being paid the minimum wage. We can look at that to find out information about people not getting paid overtime. We also used data from Iowa workforce development enforcement efforts and federal enforcement efforts. And we basically combined all this data to get to these estimates, which are conservative estimates. Every chance along the way that we could take a path between something that is more conservative in terms of, like, let's take the lower end of what it could probably be. We took those conservative estimates. So 900 million is really the lower end of what we expect it to be.
And that's honestly a shock to hear, right? I naturally hear 900 million. Iowa's not really that big, right? That's a pretty darn big number. That means a lot more. That either means a lot of people are impacted by this, or a few people are basically working for free. You know what I mean? So you basically took U.S. Census Bureau data, broke that up demographically, and applied it to Iowa using that demographic data. Is that a fair representation?
I would just give one edit, being that we used U.S. Census Bureau data for Bureau of Labor Statistics data for just Iowans. So if you look through all that survey data, you can eliminate everybody who doesn't, who's not from Iowa. And we just looked at Iowans from 2017 to 2019. So it's not, looking at the national and applying to Iowa, which oftentimes that's the technique used. This we're even more confident in because it's just Iowans that we were looking at.
Right. Yeah, obviously. I'm glad you brought that up, because if you took national crime data, broke it up demographically, applied it to Iowa, it would be inaccurate, right? That wouldn't even be close. So now when you go to data, right, you mentioned you got some data from Iowa workforce development, some data from elsewhere. So when you do look at Iowa workforce development data, I think they had their 2021 annual report. I believe you did use part of that, right?
I did refer to it. Yep.
Yeah. And I think they received 366 wage theft claims. And this was in the register. Anybody can read this. I believe you probably provided this. But they settled 341 of those claims, collecting $250,000, $253,000. So, I mean, that's that data. Can you explain to listeners how obviously that data is different than the data that was published in the register that you have? Which isn't a surprise to you. So can you explain, like, if you're pulling from their data, and their data is that way, and your data says 900 million, what explains the discrepancy?
Yeah, great question. So first off, you have to think about, okay, who and how many people are reporting claims to Iowa workforce development. So that's the big one. If you look at all of the number of people who are experiencing some form of wage theft, a bunch of them probably don't know that they're experiencing wage theft. They don't understand that their rights are being violated. A bunch of them may realize that their rights are being violated and don't feel comfortable going to the government about it, or they don't know the process. A bunch of other reasons can get in the way of people actually filing a claim with Iowa workforce development. And in fact, we think that the percentage of people who actually file the claim is well under 1% of
Wow.
people who are actually experiencing wage theft. So those people who make it through all those hurdles file claims, and then a percentage of them have claims that Iowa workforce development can process and get their money back. So at the end of the day, you get that $250,000 a year, which is pretty consistent with previous years. And if you look at it in terms of, okay, this is only a tiny fraction of what is actually happening out there, that overall number is what we were aiming to get at with that $900 million.
I mean, so the obvious question here is, if a worker doesn't even know, how would Iowa Workforce Development or you or the U.S. Census Bureau know, right? Like, if they don't even know, if I go to work, I don't clock in, or whatever the reason is that there's wage theft, or my boss is just a jerk and says, screw you, Brady, I'm not going to pay you because you smell bad. That never happened, by the way, just in case anyone's wondering. If you don't know, if the workers don't know, how do we have any data whatsoever on that?
Well, it's limited data, the data that we do have. But the way that we're able to tell is by really kind of zeroing in on the types of ways that wage theft happen. So, for example, one of the major categories is minimum wage laws. A lot of people know that there is a minimum wage, or they might know what it is, but sometimes it's kind of fuzzy, like cases where people get paid a certain amount of dollars per week, and then they work a bunch of hours. They're not necessarily, maybe they don't do the math and say, okay, how much am I actually getting paid minimum wage on an hourly basis? Maybe they don't realize that they still deserve to get paid have the right to be paid the minimum wage. Or other scenarios like tipped workers who have a low base salary for minimum wage. It's $4.35 in Iowa, but the law actually is, if you are a tipped worker earning a sub $7.25 minimum hourly rate, if your tips don't take you up to at least $7.25 an hour, your employer is supposed to make up that difference. So by pointing out, first off, we look into the data and we look for, okay, what is this person actually making, regardless of what they know about wage payment laws. The other way we know about it is from previous surveys that have been conducted, asking people about specific examples, like, has your employer ever required you to work after you've punched out? Maybe the person didn't realize that was a violation of their rights, but now we know that this happened to them, and we can say this was a form of wage theft.
Okay, got it. So some of it is also based on survey data. So how was that survey data collected? Was it pretty much just a web survey, and you basically asked people, has this ever happened? Is it self-reported, I guess is what I'm asking.
It is self-reported, yes. So I will make a note, the report and the main findings were not based on that type of survey data, but we did use that type of survey data to sort of validate the findings that we came to. So we used kind of the most robust methods to get to our main estimates, and then we used some other forms of data to kind of do a validity check, do a common sense check, like does this check out? So there are survey results from workers who were surveyed in some major cities across the US, and that was when they were asked about things like, have you ever worked off the clock? Have you ever not been allowed to take a meal break? Have you ever had something taken off of your paycheck that you didn't know what it was? Things like that. And we used those survey results to find actually a very similar result for the overall estimates in Iowa.
Oh, I mean, but those are national though, so
Exactly. So
yeah.
that's why we used it as only a backup, a secondary thing to just do a kind of validity check. But it was actually pretty surprising to me how similar the outcomes were.
Yeah, I mean, but just, I mean, you're a policy analyst, right? Or not, excuse me, not a policy. Yeah, a policy analyst. So maybe there's some things I'm not aware of, right? But I'm really struggling, and we'll move on because I have more questions on this, but I'm really struggling to understand the 250,000 to 900 million loss. Like, and I'm not saying you're wrong, right? Clearly not saying that because I don't know. But when I hear this many cases were reported to Iowa Workforce Development and, make up a percentage, it looks like they're saying most of them were settled. They solved most of them, whatever. But in my mind, that's pretty hard, clear data. We have it linked as linked to complaints. These are real people. But the 900 million number seems kind of like a guess to me. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but like in my mind, if we want to really nail people to the frickin' wall and get them to pay what they owe, it needs to be a little bit more clear, at least for me. But what are the reasons? Because I'm assuming not 100% of this is nefarious, right? I'm assuming not 100% of this is bosses trying to screw the little guy. I assume a lot of this may be errors, or am I wrong? Maybe I'm wrong.
It's hard to say what percent of what's going on is just due to errors on the employer's side. I'm sure I would agree with you that it's not 100% of it is nefarious, but it's something that we really don't know. And so I think something that we put forward in the report as a policy recommendation is we need much more education. We need education for workers about their rights. We need education for employers about their obligations. And so I think education is actually a very key component of the solution to it. I will note, related to this question of how do we make that jump from 250,000 to 900 million, that while Iowa Workforce Development recovers approximately $200,000 to $300,000 a year, the federal enforcement agency, the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division, recovers closer to $2 million for Iowa workers each year. So if you look at that, okay, the total agencies combined, state and federal, are recovering $2.25 million for Iowa workers each year. That maybe kind of helps you think about, okay, that's maybe more realistic in terms of how you're thinking about that gap between now 2.25 million and 900 million, and just the vast amount of people who have barriers in their way to reporting this crime. First off, I mean, most people probably don't even realize they can report it. Who do you go to? How do
you can't call the police for something like that. Basically, and I'm really glad we're getting into this, right? But basically, maybe this is a good way to summarize this. The data that you have shows that only X% of people, you said it earlier, we can, people can rewind the tape, obviously, but the data you have shows only X% of people report. Here is the reported number. Therefore, if you apply the percentage, here's the 100% number, give or take a few million, correct?
Yeah, that's a good summary.
I think that makes sense. To be quite honest with you, I think that makes sense. Obviously, we don't know for sure if that number applies to Iowa, right? Because that survey data comes from different cities. But I think it's a good starting point for sure. What other reasons are you seeing outside of just like accidents for wage loss?
Well, a lot of employers do know what they're doing. it's cutting corners. It's, this is not all employers in Iowa. Obviously, I would say the majority of Iowa employers are upstanding. They follow the law. They follow their obligations. But there are employers out there who are cutting corners, and they do it at the expense of workers. So what happens is they find ways here and there to cheat the workers out of the money that they're owed. For one example,
yeah, I was going to ask you for some examples.
Yeah, absolutely. So for one example, there are cases, and this is something that a lot of the examples that I know about are cases that the Center for Worker Justice of Eastern Iowa has worked on, because we are collaborators on this issue of wage theft. One example was a worker who worked for as a janitorial staff for a Eastern Iowa restaurant chain of sorts. They had multiple locations. This worker did janitorial work for multiple locations, and she would work over 40 hours a week oftentimes, and she would therefore be owed overtime pay for all the worked hours worked past 40 in a week. But the employer was splitting up her hours between different restaurant locations, paying her from different accounts, even though she did overtime at one location, and therefore try and skirt paying overtime rates by paying out of different bank accounts, essentially. Another case is my colleague at the University of Iowa Labor Center. He does some education for workers around their rights. He was talking to some roofers, and one of the roofers asked a question. He said, "Why is it that roofers don't get owed, can't get paid overtime rates?" And the labor educator, he just kind of was in shock for a moment. He said, "Where did you hear that? That's not the law." He said, "Oh, well, my boss told me that roofers just aren't, that we're not part of the law. We're not covered. We don't get paid overtime." That's just an example of just blatant lying. So those are just a couple of examples of ways that this can happen.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone would deny they've heard some of those stories, right? Yeah. Like I've heard some bosses say some absolutely crazy stuff, right? So yeah, I think also in the piece you mention that there's a major lack of enforcement. And so, why is that? It seems, at least again, going back to the Iowa workforce development, it seems like they're at least enforcing the cases brought to them. Are they leaving out certain cases? Is there a minimum criteria to have your case looked into? How would increasing enforcement help here?
So there are a couple of key components to this that I want to highlight.
Yeah.
One is that there's an opportunity to improve the law around this. So this would be a state legislative issue. The current wage payment collection code in Iowa law does not allow Iowa workforce development to preemptively go out there and investigate. So they can only respond to individual cases brought by workers, their claims. They can't go and check up on businesses and say, we've noticed that you were a repeat violator in the past, and we want to see if you're doing it, following the law now. They can't say, hotels are notorious for wage theft. Let's do some checks on hotels around the state. They can't do anything preemptive. So that's one major issue. They can't go out there. Another issue is that there's a limited capacity of Iowa workforce development. Currently, they have only two actively working wage theft investigators, wage claim investigators, what they call them. So more employees would help the cases go faster, would probably increase communications and increase people's confidence that their case will be responded to. And the final thing I'll highlight is that Iowa workforce development has a cap on the amount of the claim that a worker can file. It's $6,500. And so if a worker has a claim for over $6,500, maybe they've been screwed out of overtime for consistently every week for a year or something like that, and they've got a major case, Iowa Workforce Development automatically turns it away. So they're turning away the biggest cases, and they say, "Oh, well, you can get an attorney," and that's, I think, very unrealistic for the type of workers who are going to be bringing these cases. So those are some major actions that I think need to be taken.
Yeah, and why did they give you, and obviously you're not a legal expert, right? So I don't expect, this isn't fair to ask you specifically. So if you don't know, you can say you don't know. But did they give you any indication of why they won't do that? Is it just once it crosses that barrier, it becomes quite a big legal thing and they just don't have the bandwidth to handle it? Why is that?
Yeah, the reasoning that I got from them was that, so $6,500 is the upper limit for small claims court. So that's it's not arbitrary. That's how they picked it.
Got it.
And the reason they cite for it is that if it's above $6,500, you can take it. It's not small claims court anymore. You can get an attorney and file a civil lawsuit. And I think that it sounds like they do that because they don't really have the capacity to take on those bigger cases. So I don't know if that's an issue of capacity in terms of those types of cases would take more legal work or what necessarily that capacity issue is. But yeah, that's their general reasoning for not taking those bigger cases.
And that's such a tough spot, like it drives me personally. I think this is the best country in the world, but it drives me absolutely nuts that, you have to, in some cases, spend a lot of time and your own money in order to get money owed to you. I mean, that's just the American legal system. I was on jury duty, and I'll be honest, it restored a lot of my faith. Judge Porter was our judge, and it restored a lot of my faith in the legal system. I was blown away by, at least in Iowa, I was blown away by how thorough, how professional, and how detailed they were, and how amazingly careful they were to follow the law and not like mislead us, the jury. And even the attorneys, right? Like the only experience I had with attorneys is like watching Suits, which is definitely not reality, right? And I was just stunned at how respectful the attorneys were to each other, to the judge, and how both attorneys, both sides were like really careful to get it right and be clear and be respectful to everyone. It was absolutely amazing. But that is kind of the dark spot in law is, sure, you can do something illegal. Anybody can do something illegal to me, but then I have to actually go after them in the court of law. You know what I mean? Unless it's criminal. And so, it's such a difficult topic for sure. What is the fine?
It is. Go ahead. Such a burden on the worker to take their claim and follow this whole process, whether they're doing it in a lawsuit or if it's through the administrative process. Either way, it's really quite burdensome to the worker. It's really a shame. It really
is. And I would recommend to everybody, I don't think everybody knows this, so Iowa Legal Aid is a great entity, but also a lot of attorneys, I know several of them, do a lot of pro bono work. And I was just, I don't know if he wants me to reference this conversation. So I was just talking with one a couple days ago, and he in particular is very, very passionate about Iowa workers' rights. And so they do take pro bono cases because a lot of them get involved in law because they see the injustice out there and want to help it. So if you do have a case, I would present that to an attorney that shares your that shares a passion for where you're at in your life. If it's like, if you are a victim of wage theft, I would say get in touch with Iowa Legal Aid or reach out to attorneys that say they specialized in worker help. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but
absolutely. I think that's a great suggestion.
What about fines? Like, what is the fine? Like, let's say in a perfect world, a worker catches this, right? That's obviously a part of it. And they are owed $3,000. They do a complaint. It is you mentioned that restaurant in the eastern part of Iowa. Can you say who that was, by the way?
I believe that is confidential information because of the settlement agreement.
Okay, got it. So we won't bring that up. But an example of that entity, Like if this individual goes through the process and Iowa Workforce Development says, hey, hold up here. You do owe this lady extra money. Do they get fined? Do they get a slap on the wrist? And what determines what fines they pay?
Right. Great question. So the structure for fines is actually it's much more complicated than you might imagine. So the law allows up to $500 fine per pay period during which there was a violation. That's the allowable amount. Iowa Workforce Development has its own administrative rules that go into detail about what conditions allow or come with certain fines. A lot of the time it's much smaller amount, especially for first-time violations or given certain circumstances.
Sure, yeah.
And I actually don't have information or the data about the amount of fines that were assessed for any of the businesses that or employers that were caught doing some kind of wage payment violation in the past 5 years. This is data that I am very interested in. I'll probably need to file an open records request to view it because it's not publicly available, although it is under the, it's publicly accessible, but they don't post it on the website. You have to go through a request process. So maximum $500 per pay period, which you did a violation. We know that most of the time they don't pursue the maximum $500. And I'm not even sure how much they do fine violators of the law.
Okay. Yeah. So we're not entirely, they don't, like you said, you'd have to do an open records request to find that.
Mm-hmm.
And now that's just obviously automatic though, right? That's within their purview what the Iowa Workforce Development will find. That doesn't mean this woman who is working at this chain of restaurants in eastern part of Iowa can't come and sue them in like a civil case, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, so she can still do that. That would just basically be a fine from Iowa Workforce Development, but it's still illegal.
Paid to the state.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So what is the process then like to empower workers? Because earlier you mentioned that most workers don't even know there's a process for this, right? So the obvious question here is, what should you do to make sure you're not a victim of wage theft? Because it sounds like a lot of people don't even know.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are a victim, what's the next step?
Right. So I would encourage all workers to Google, wage payment rights Iowa or something to that effect. You can find some resources from the University of Iowa Labor Center, which is the labor center for the whole state. They do a lot of educational work, and they've got good resources online. So read up on your rights. Tell other people about their rights. You can tell your friends, tell your family. Spread the word. Unfortunately, that's the best way to do it when there's, no kind of systematic way of educating people. But I think, if you're a teacher at a high school or something, tell your students about it. So education, I think, is really key. Educating yourself and others about your rights. If you do realize that your rights have been violated, you've got options. So always the first thing I, recommend is that if you're comfortable, talk to other workers that work with you. Talk to your coworkers about if they've had similar experiences. If other workers at your job have a similar experience, you will absolutely be stronger if you work on this together. Share resources, share information. That's always going to work out better in your favor. Regardless, your options are to, go to Iowa Legal Aid, talk to a lawyer. You can, if it's convenient for you, you can go to the Center for Worker Justice, and they will help you figure out your options. One of which is to file a claim with Iowa Workforce Development. There's a website for that. There's a claim form.
You don't need to memorize all that. Well, we can put that on the show notes, obviously.
Yeah, okay,
but you mentioned,
great.
but you mentioned the Center for Worker Justice.
Yes.
And then also Iowa Workforce Development. Should they go to both, or like which one should they start with?
I would suggest starting with Center for Worker Justice or Iowa Legal Aid. They'll help you figure out what the best course of action is. Because, it depends on what kind of wage theft you experienced, what kind of documentation you have of it. All of that is going to help inform what your best course of action is. And you might not even be able to file with the state because if it's an overtime violation, it has to be federal. So there are just details that really is going to help you you the most if you talk to somebody who's familiar with those.
Correct me if I'm wrong on this, Sean, but I think maybe first step would simply be to go to your employer and say, hey, did I mess something up? Or, hey, are my records right? Or am I missing some payment for this period? And just see what they say. You don't need to incriminate. You don't need to go after them and say, you didn't do this. Just come at them, or my gosh, not come at them. Come ask them, hey, am I clear that this is correct? And just have so that way, if you do go file a complaint, you can say, I did bring this up, and it wasn't this innocent mistake. Because I will say, like you said earlier, you said the majority of people are trying to do the right thing here. It's the minority ripping people off. I mean, I will say $900 million, that's a minority of people that are really ripping people off. But, if we believe that is true, and I agree with you, Sean, I think it's the minority really screwing people over and the majority want to do things right, go have a conversation and just make sure it's accurate, because that might save you and your employer a lot of pain.
Sure.
Sean, I'm sure people are interested listening to this. So if they want to reach out to you or understand more about what Common Good Iowa is up to, how do they find you and how do they find your organization?
Sure. So you can go to commongoodiowa.org. That's the website. You can find the report on there, as well as our full methodology if you really want to learn about all those data details. And you can also reach me at sfinn, S-F-I-N-N, at commongoodiowa.org.
Perfect. And I will make sure to post all of that on the show notes. So if you're driving or you're listening on your run or something, you don't have to write that all down, especially if you're driving. My word, don't do that. We will have all of that posted at iowapodcast.com. Sean Finn, policy analyst at Common Good Iowa. Thank you so very much for coming on the Iowa Podcast.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate all your questions.
And to my fellow Iowans, Iowa expats, and Iowans at heart, thanks for listening and subscribing to the Iowa Podcast.